For example, this was a Vox article. So this guy, David Roberts, is like Vox's in-house expert on climate change issues. He's the person that writes on this stuff all the time. And so this came out in late April, right? So this was well before Trump made his announcement. And what was he saying? No country on earth is taking the 2-degree climate target seriously. All right, and there was I didn't include it because I wanted to have room here, but there was a photo of Earth on fire going along just to make sure you get how serious this is. All right, so the point is here, they weren't taking it seriously. Here's something from, I apologize if I blew it up, that would get fuzzy. Let me just, so this is this thing, you can go to climateactiontracker.org. So this is very much a website in favor of government intervention, right? This isn't like from the Heritage Foundation, so this is very much in favor of it. And they have this thermometer, and so over here, they've got the pledges. So they're saying if all the governments of the world met the pledges they made when they joined the Paris Agreement, right? If they lived up to those unilaterally imposed obligations, then our best estimate is that would limit warming to 2.8 degrees. Okay, so we're blowing way past the 2C absolute ceiling, even if they all did what they said they were going to do. And then, but there's another nuance. They say, instead of looking at what do they say they were going to do, let's look at their current policies right now and say if they just kept those in place, what are we on track for? And there, their warming was 3.6 degrees Celsius. Okay, so again, what's my point here is even just before Trump pulled out, everybody who was like for this thing was saying the governments of the world, we're not anywhere near hitting this thing. Even if all the participants did what they said they were going to do, we would blow way past this 2C target. Come on, people. So then Trump says, you know what, this whole thing is a sham. We're not doing this. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, now we're all dead. Do you see how, like, using marginal analysis, you can see, wait a minute, if we were all dead before he did it, and we're all dead after he did it, then him pulling out really isn't why we're all dead, even on your own terms, okay? So that's the importance of marginal analysis for you right there. Okay. So thus far, I've shown you, I think, compelling arguments that even if they agreed to, or even if they met their targets, you know, the things they agreed to, it wouldn't hit it. Clearly, if you look at the weaker thing of what are they actually doing right now, because in other words, you could agree to something that's onerous and then not follow through with it because it's always politically easier just to kick it down the road, right? Like you could say, yeah, I intend to lose 30 pounds before that wedding, and then, you know, and suppose you were 50 pounds overweight, and then you could say, well, even if you did that, you would still be overweight. But then looking and say, you know what, you're not going to the gym. You keep eating pizza every night. So clearly, if we look at the policy, what you're actually doing, then that's even further away from what you said your goal is. Okay, so I've explained to you all that and what a farce this is, but it gets even worse, or better, depending if you like paradox. Again, everybody, it's hard for me to emphasize just how much everybody agrees. Oh, of course, we got to limit it to 2C. That's a given. I mean, you go beyond 2C, we're talking about catastrophe, like ice sheets collapsing and, you know, that all, Bangladesh people being drowned and so forth. It's crazy. And you then say, okay, well, surely then the consensus science, this thing that the UN publishes it periodically, the IPCC reports, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is the thing that codifies all the latest peer-reviewed research in terms of the, you know, the natural science, like just, with emissions of greenhouse gases, what about methane versus CO2? What's the global warming potential of those two gases? You know, that sort of thing. And then they also have things about mitigation efforts, like, okay, what steps could governments do? Various things. What about adaptation? Okay, suppose certain warming is inevitable. Will farmers plant crops differently and people might move and we'll build more dikes and so forth because of sea level rise? Right, they have all this stuff. There's humongous volumes of documents here, or papers summarizing all the literature from the last one. You go to that thing, and I tried to do this when it all came out in the last issue, and I was saying, okay, surely I'm going to be able to see why the 2 degrees Celsius target makes sense. Right? In other words, that using their own numbers, the benefits to humanity of limiting emissions to 2C or warming to 2C will clearly outweigh the costs. Right? Just the way they do things, because they have cost-benefit figures in this document. So surely, and it turned out, no, that's not true. I can use the UN's own document to make a pretty strong case that the 2C target is a bad idea. Right? So Again, this is what I'm talking about, and I'm going to come later at the end of this talk to a more Rothbardian approach. So I'm not saying in general, certainly not Rothbardian libertarians are going to go around running cost-benefit analyses, especially on stuff like this, but I'm just saying to show you how crazy it is using their own stuff. The cure they're proposing is worse than the disease. All right, so here, I realize this might be difficult to see, but just to give you an example. So this was a chart or a table that I took from the last issue of this UN document, and you can see they have the consumption losses in cost-effective scenarios, meaning if governments rationally and efficiently limit warming using the best possible means, which of course in practice governments wouldn't do, but even a best-case scenario, this row right here is what they would need to do to limit to 2C warming, to have a good chance of doing it. This is the atmospheric concentration. You can see they give numbers. So by the year 2050, they're saying percent reduction in consumption relative to the baseline. They're saying, oh, in the year 2050, if governments take measures that would likely limit warming by 2100 to 2C, the economy in the year 2050 will be 3.4% smaller than it otherwise would have been. And by 2100, it'll be 4.8% lower. Okay, so this is the cost of these measures to limit global warming. All right, and so then you say, okay, so those are like the costs. The economy as of the year 2100 would be 4.8% lower, or the consumption technically would be 4.8% lower than it otherwise would be. So then you say, okay, so what are the benefits? And so to do that, so think about it. There's going to be a certain amount of global warming, they say, it's going to cause damages. And then they're saying if we limit the warming to 2C by the year 2100, that's going to cost our economy 4.8%. Right, because now instead of doing the cheapest ways of producing electricity, we got to switch away from coal-fired plants and go towards wind or solar. Instead of driving cars that use gasoline, more people are going to switch over to electric cars more quickly than they otherwise would have done. Right. So in other words, if we're forcing people to do things differently, then clearly that has a cost. Otherwise, they would have done it voluntarily. Right. So that's the idea. So they're quantifying. So you say, okay, so on their own charts, tables, they're saying it's going to cost 4.8% by 2100. So what's the benefit? And there, if you think about it, well, it's not just the gross damages of what's unrestrained global warming going to do by the year 2100. You got to use marginal analysis, because even on their own terms, if there's 2C of warming, there's still going to be climate change damages. So to figure out, is that it makes sense to do is you need to look at the change. You need to say, what's the likely amount of global warming if we do nothing as governments? How much damage would there be? Then what if we impose these limits to limit it to 2C? How much damage would there be with 2C of warming? And then that difference is how much we've spared ourselves by this. And then how does that compare to the 4.8 number? That's what you would need to do. So I went through that, and they don't even have the numbers in the right form, right? So it's hard to dig that stuff up. But using approximations and looking at various things that they do give you, I could back it up and say, clearly by 2050, it's not even close. And by 2100, it's basically a wash. In other words, if all the governments of the world did things perfectly efficiently, optimally limited it, blah, 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 it looks like it's close to being about a wash, but it's still slightly worse in terms of the cost to the economy. So, isn't that interesting? That number one, if you try to run the numbers using their own stuff, it doesn't fully work. It looks at best like it's a wash. But number two, like I say, I had to go through and be a detective and grab stuff. It's not like it's all in one spot. So it's just showing that this is really sort of a foregone conclusion, that the people participating in this, they already knew that the answer was going to be, oh, we have to do something. They're just trying to illustrate the specific reasons. But there's nowhere in those things where you could actually see a formal case of, yes, the reason it makes sense using our own methodology or whatever to do this is because here's the cost, here's the benefits. They don't even make that case anywhere. I had to kind of piece it together myself, drawing on various sections of the document. Okay, another little slippery thing, just watch out for. Notice what they did here. They say, where's my thing? Percentage point reduction in annualized consumption growth rate. From here, they said 0.06%. So when this document came out several years ago, a lot of people were running around and saying, oh, UN says the cost of fighting global change is virtually negligible. Because what they're saying here is it would only be a reduction in the rate of growth of 0.06 percentage points. So like if normally the economy around the world would grow at 3%, if we have these policies, to fight climate change, then it would only be, 2.94%, right? And you think, it's a rounding error. But you see the sleight of hand there, that if you have that little bit of a reduction in the growth rate over 90 years, well, then by this year, that the actual difference between what it would have been and what it is now is a bigger number. And so that's fine. I mean, it's not like the math is wrong, but they weren't then saying, and I did this when these kind of spins came out, and I said, oh, UN reports the cost of climate change is negligible. Because I looked at like some of the bad scenarios of what climate change damage would do in the year 2200, and then I just showed, well, even if there's a 50% hit to the world by 2200 in terms of the percentage that you need rolling over all that time exponentially to get to that isn't a big number in any one year. And so you could use the same trick just to show, see, it's not a big deal. But of course, they weren't framing it like that. So again, just showing that you can take these numbers, you go and read this stuff and see what they're actually saying, and it doesn't add up.